Those of you who followed me for any length of time remember that I did a video about a game called Final Fantasy VIII. You may or may not have watched that video because you're probably not interested in Final Fantasy VIII, but at the very beginning I did a little bit of a discussion, which basically had to do with, to summarize excessively, the different ways in which the human mind works, which accounts for such things as personal preference, taste, etc. I explained why FF6 was my favorite game of all time. Rewatching this movie, it becomes so clear to me, because I have the exact same reaction to this movie that I do FF6. Or I should say these movies, really. We'll see if Return ends up being better than Empire at the end. But rewatching this movie was nothing but a joy. And I actually found myself just gushing over it. I do apologize in advance. I've noticed a trend amongst my videos. When I have things to critique or otherwise discuss what they did wrong, usually I end up talking longer because I'm explaining what they did wrong and how, than if they did things right. So it's entirely possible this video would actually be shorter. It's not intentional. I never actually go into my videos with a set length in mind. I just record until I'm done. So, that being said, Empire Strikes Back had several key things going for it. Two really big things, okay? Now, well, actually, more like 50 really big things, but I want to talk about these two things up front, because I have often said that George Lucas is not that bad of a creative individual. He's just one of those kinds of creative individuals, myself included, who works best when working in a group. So, someone like him, when matched with someone like, say, Spielberg, well, that tends to work out very well, doesn't it? This movie is usually my grade A example, though. See, George Lucas, there's two things that happened here. Number one thing, George Lucas decided after his phenomenal, groundbreaking success of Star Wars A New Hope, he decided to go ahead and bankroll Empire basically out of his own pocketbook. It's the actual economics of how that works and the accounting of how that works is a little more complicated than that, but the point that you need to understand is he didn't get external backing. That meant, and this was the important part, that he was the sole owner of this franchise, that he owns the right to Star Wars, and no one else could step in and say, well, you should do this. Now, it's funny I say that as a good thing, because you might be like, well, why is that a good thing? We've seen what happens when Lucas takes total control. Episode 1 happens, to be blunt. But the point is, giving him that total control completely removed all external factors and influences and pressures from the equation, which allowed him to do what he wanted to do, which was hand the reins of the movie over to someone else, basically. Now, to make this clear, George Lucas was still involved in the creation of Empire and Return. He still did a lot of work on the scripts. He still did a decent amount of directing work and a lot of the shots, and he was a consultant for basically every step of the way. But the actual director, the guy actually out there saying, I want you to act like this, I want you to put the camera here and look at it in this direction, that was a gentleman whose name I wrote down, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, named Irvin Kershner. Irvinkershner. And I spell that out because I honestly urge you, if you have not seen any of his works, to look into them, if you're any kind of a fan of cinematography in general. Here's the funny thing. Irvin there was someone who... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to finish my first point first. The other thing Lucas did is he basically let someone else actually write the words on the page in order to actually produce the script for Empire. He still did the story. He still did the skeleton work. But the person who actually wrote the lines was someone else, and that worked out brilliantly. And forgive me for being blunt, but it really shows. But again, one of the main reasons it shows is Irvin there, because he is an incredible director when it comes to character-driven pieces. If you look at any of his body of works, it's no surprise he was picked for this. He is very good at pulling out an amazing performance from tightly focused, character-driven scenes. And let's be honest with ourselves, that's kind of Empire in a nutshell, isn't it? If you really think about it, the biggest weak point of Empire, and this was mentioned both in the day and is still mentioned to this day, is the fact that it basically has no plot. The plot is Vader's after Skywalker, and that actually is the plot right there. Anything else is something that is being influenced by that. But that's not the strong point of this movie. That's not one of the reasons why everyone considers this movie to be the greatest. This movie has nothing but incredible character scenes. All the hallmarks of what we think of nowadays as C-3PO, as Darth Vader, as Luke Skywalker, as Han Solo, as Londo Calrissian, as all of these different characters basically really started here. There was some groundwork laid in A New Hope. Let's not mistake that. But A New Hope was never really made with the intention to directly lead into a further story arc, whereas Empire definitively was, and it does show. For those of you who've looked at my video game videos at all, this is basically the difference between Kingdom Hearts 1 and Kingdom Hearts 2. In other words, they tried something, and it worked, and they had a vague idea of where they wanted to go with it. But when they made the next game, in this case, when they made the next movie, they knew exactly where they wanted to go with it, and they did. And so they could do groundwork. They could spend time just focusing on establishment. I'll talk more about that later, especially thematically. We'll pull that in pretty much at the end of this video. It is also worth noting, I'm going to talk about this more later, but the Darth Vader reveal, which is partially a reveal and partially a twist, which I'll define in a moment, is usually most film geeks, myself included, point to this video, this particular instance of it, as the moment at which the twist being a big thing in movies kind of became popular amongst movie producers and movie makers in general. Obviously, some movies pull that off well. Matrix, Fight Club, I can think of a few others. And some movies don't. In fact, in my opinion, the vast majority of movies are actually weakened by the fact that they have to force some kind of twist into a movie. Sometimes movies even made by the same person. Cough, cough. M. Night Shyamalan. Shoot, I don't even know how to say his name. I am terrible. That guy. Because in my opinion, Sixth Sense was a well-done twist, because it was a part twist and part reveal. Whereas the other ones, not so much. But I said I'd talk about the twist reveal thing. I've talked about this before, but to refresh it a little bit. A reveal is us learning something new about a situation that there is foreshadowing for, and that there is build-up for. It's not just bam, oh my god. It's more like da-da-da-da-da-da, it's build up and it emphasized, and suddenly, oh my god, it's like a payoff situation. By contrast, a twist is usually the exact opposite of that. In other words, da-da-da, everything's going along, and suddenly everything is wrong. Something comes along that completely throws everything into question. The reason I say there is a third category is because a reveal twist is basically the best elements of both. There is foreshadowing that Vader is Luke's father, but it is not obvious. In fact, it's not even apparent. You're not even looking for it until your second viewing. But that is the best kind of foreshadowing, in my honest opinion, because it's the kind of foreshadowing that allows repeat value, basically, repeat gameplay or repeat viewings of the movie in question. And you go back through and it's like, oh, and there's only a few tidbits, and they're very minor, but they are there. And they were done even back in the day. This is not stuff that was added or changed in the special edition, so definite props there. And it also contains all the elements that make a twist appealing. Because the point of a twist, I mean, nowadays, you usually refer to a twist in a game or a movie, and most people look at that as a bad thing, because so many things have done the twist wrong. See the Bionic Commando reboot. It's a pretty good example of a twist done really wrong, to use a video game example. But the point of a twist and the appeal of a twist is it takes everything, the ideal of a twist, I should say, is it takes everything that at first seemed like it was all, to use an extremely basic metaphor, red. But when you do the twist, you're looking at it from a different angle and you realize it's actually violet or purple or blue or whatever. It completely changes your perspective, and therefore when you go back and in hindsight, or indeed on repeat viewings and playthroughs, it's like, oh. So it is possible to do a reveal twist, something that is foreshadowed, something that is built up to, but at the same time, when it pays off, it completely changes the way you're looking at the game, or in this case, in the movie. Now, one thing I noticed immediately is that this movie feels way, way more polished than A New Hope, and it should. It had much better budget, it had much better establishment. Empire is what we call a classic sequel. There are generally two types of sequels that happen. This is especially true when it comes to movies. But this is true as gaming as well. I've talked about this in gaming. Either what you have is a situation where you have already done the work, and now you've taken it, and you've worked with it, and you've understood it, and basically you have leveled up in your ability to make a movie, or make a game, or whatever. And so now you know what you're doing, you're more familiar with the actors, you're more familiar with the crew, you're more familiar with the people behind the scenes, the writer has a better idea of where he wants to go with the story, and this is important, and the first movie was successful, which means now budget is no longer as much of a problem. It's still a problem, You can't go overboard. But the fact you were successful means you can actually put more money into the things that matter, as long as you're smart about it. And so, the example of a good sequel is basically the first movie, but better. If you're understanding me, because everyone knows what they're doing better. Just to discuss in brief, the idea of a bad sequel is usually they tried something new and it failed, or they were getting tired of doing it, or they were just hashing it out because they wanted to cash in on the popularity of the first movie and therefore didn't actually put effort into the second movie. But the distinction, especially when it comes to movies, is most of the time, when you see that kind of a bad sequel, it's being made by different people. Different people behind the scenes, different people involved in it. Sometimes it's the same actors, Spider-Man 3, but most of the people actually involved in constructing that movie were different than the ones who made Spider-Man 1 and 2, for example. When you have the same team, you tend, not always, but tend to get a better performance out, and Empire is pretty much a classic example of that. Empire is also usually credited for starting a lot of cliches, tropes, etc. in fiction in general, but most especially amongst movies. I'll be mentioning a few of these as we go, but it's worth noting that I don't think it's I think it's fair to say that it's not just nostalgia that makes me rewatch this movie and say, wow, you know, it still strikes me as amazing. As I mentioned earlier, that chemical thing, this movie fits my brain so well. And every moment I was just exuding joy at watching it. And again, it's because so much obvious effort was on display. They really tried to really squeeze the performance out of the actors and out of the sets and out of the music. That brings me to John Williams. John Williams was another incredibly crucial element of this movie, and indeed all three of the movies, hell, all six if I'm being blunt. But the thing is, a lot of composers, and this is true back then, but as well as nowadays, when they become famous because they did a really good work, or they made a lot of money, they tend to get cocky or lazy. I'm not even sure what the proper wording here is, but basically they tend to just repeat that performance. They just kind of say, oh, well, I've hit, this, and this was amazing, so now I'm going to make nothing but this kind of a situation. John Williams has never really done that. Now, he's good at certain things. I should rephrase this. He is great at certain things. But John Williams has a great deal of range in his music, and he likes to show it off. He likes to stretch. So while he is most best known for his soaring trumpets and his epic scale strings and all that fun stuff, he does know how to stretch. And again, it shows. If you compare the soundtracks to A New Hope versus Empire Strikes Back, the difference is striking. He goes way out of his way to use music as it should be in a movie. The music, I've often said this myself, and I've heard other directors say this. Music in a movie is just as much an actor, is just as much a character in the movie as the actors are portraying. You follow? So he actually works to make the music really fit with every single scene that it's playing in, and really complement whatever's going on, and really highlight and accent what's going on. It keeps you in the moment, which makes the silent moments all the more powerful. I'll talk about that later as well. And of course, this is also true in the special effects department. ILM, at this point, was no longer a struggling, barely cognizant company, but instead was someone who was basically very successful and doing some really good work. And this is just ILM in general. I mean, I talked about this on my stream, the idea of over-reliance on CGI. And I've said it before, CGI doesn't bother me as long as you use it within moderation as a tool. Cool with that. But one of the things I like about ILM and the stuff they've done over the years is they tend to be very creative. Good example, Hoth Battle. A lot of that was miniatures over a beautifully painted matte painting. And you can actually see it. If you ever, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the pictures of the people setting up the models on a thing that's probably bigger than my room here is, with the snow and with the beautiful matte paintings. And that's how they did it. There were lots of other things that they were thinking about doing, lots of other ways they could present that, but that's what they chose. It was creative, it worked, and it looks beautiful. It's amazing. And I also feel like adding one other thing about that, just as a fun note. There's a scene where Luke, it's only 2 shots, 2 separate edits, okay? It's right after Luke has gotten out of the cave, way back at the beginning of Hoth. And he gets out of there, and oh my god, and then he tumbles down the hill, and then we have a long shot. So those 2 shots prior to the long shot, those are shot 10, 15 feet outside of a hotel. that they were actually filming at, and the people were actually in the hotel, shivering in the doors and the windows and whatnot, filming out there. It's just a fun little anecdote to think about whenever you watch the movie. So here's the thing. I already mentioned. I actually have another note here, which is called the plot. But again, the lack of plot in this movie has never bothered me, not even back in the day. Most especially because this movie is so focused on its story. To reiterate, story, plot, characters, character growth, setting, which is backstory, which also includes backstory, by the way, and which because that come up recently in my stream, and of course themes. This is the story, and there is tremendous, tremendous focus on these four in Empire Strikes Back, with a little bit of a plot, which basically doesn't matter. Although it kind of does. I'll talk about that later. And the real reason I want to mention this here is because we get to see a lot of characters and just viewpoints, windows into their characters, most of which we wouldn't even have names for if not for the extended universe. And it helps to flesh out the world and the setting tremendously by, again, doing the same thing that A New Hope did, making us feel like we are in an entire galaxy rather than just, one tiny little thing. Which also brings me to another point. The set design is brilliant, and even though ultimately they only go to a couple of locations, I believe a grand total of 3, not counting ships, this Empire somehow feels like it has more breadth and depth to it than A New Hope did, at least for me. Maybe that's because of the fact that in A New Hope we basically only saw one location. Yes, I know, Yavin 4, but Yavin 4 doesn't really count, and the Death Star still qualifies as a ship. All we really saw was Tatooine. But in this one we see Hoth, we see Dagobah, of course, and we see Cloud City. Now, it's debatable if Cloud City counts, but I think it does, specifically because of the effort that was made into flesh it out. And that brings me to my next point. I'm trying to segue these better. I hope it's working. I often said that the special edition, the 1997 edition, is my favorite of the Star Wars special edition. And I talked about that extensively why last time. One big note here. I can't point to anything in Empire that I think is a negative as far as the special edition. There's a couple of additional bits of footage, the Vader going back up to the Executor, and some establishing shots of Cloud City. But otherwise, it is all just touching up in the background, and almost all of it was done in Cloud City itself. And as before, I was watching the original and the special edition side by side, and it really shines because it makes Cloud City feel much more open, much more empty, like it actually is a city in the clouds up in the sky, by adding skylights, by adding light beams, by making you see backgrounds rather than just having an empty wall, because the original version of the Cloud City has very much that 70s white sci-fi feel to it, which wasn't really done on purpose. It was more done because they needed to throw it together for that. In fact, they actually had very few sets for Cloud City. It's kind of, if you're really paying attention, it's noticeable, but the director does a really good job of making it, of hiding that. But I digress. So for those of you who don't know, a decent amount of time passed in character, in universe, between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. Now, a lot of that was covered in various ancillary books, most of which involve Darth Vader and his search for this mysterious rebel pilot who happens to have the Force. Just to confirm it for anybody who doesn't know it, and I have to mention this because apparently some people didn't, Vader was unaware of Luke Skywalker's identity. However, he was by the time Empire starts. See, he goes on this massive search to find out who this person is, because he feels like this person has such potential in the Force that they could upset the balance of power that is currently being held by himself and the Emperor. He's right, of course. But the funny thing is, he does actually find out, after extensive effort, I might add, he finds out that there is an individual named Luke Skywalker that happened to come from this area, and he finds out that that person happened to be in Mos Eisley at about the time when the Millennium Falcon left, and then he finds out that he remembers that there was a boy who was distraught at the death of Obi-Wan while the Millennium Falcon left, and he basically puts the pieces together with a little bit of info available and realizes that that is Luke Skywalker, aka his son, which he did not know he had. This is really important. Some people tend to miss on this little tidbit. Palpatine made it clear to Vader that Padme, whatever, she died, and therefore his children died. He actually, became Darth Vader thinking he had murdered not only his wife, but his children as well. There's a rather wonderful scene involving the Tarkin situation, some of you know what I'm talking about, where he comes face to face with the reality that he was a horrible, terrible murderer, and basically tries to commit suicide. I often point to that as the moment in which Anakin Skywalker went to sleep, basically, just stopped trying to even exist inside the shell of Darth Vader. Because he survived his suicide attempt for several days encased in stone, and then was unearthed, and then went back to business as if nothing had happened, as Darth Vader now. But I digress. Reason I bring this up is twofold. Number one, he knew it was Skywalker before Palpatine mentioned it. That's important, because he didn't mention it to Palpatine. Palpatine found out on his own merit, because Palpatine is freaking Palpatine. The second important note is it explains everything about Vader's approach in this movie. I'm going to talk about this more later, but effectively the only thing Vader cares about in this entire movie is getting to his son. Which brings me to a hugely important question. Who wants to see Luke more? Vader or Anakin? See, here's the thing. All of this is, again, just established, right? All of this is set in stone. We know that Vader was desperately trying to find Luke and gearing all of his resources towards it to an extensive amount, commandeering an entire squadron, a Star Destroyer squadron, which had an SSD at its head in order to go after him. I don't know how to explain how many resources and material he is devoting towards the search of one man. That's how important it was to him. But the question that is begged there is interesting because the books put this beautifully. Basically, the moment he realizes he has a son, he has a living son that is still alive, and oh my god, I believe the book puts it specifically, he feels something he has not felt in a long time. And I personally like to think of that as the moment when Anakin wakes up again. And then we see, for the first time, Anakin starts to stir in Darth Vader. Now, Darth Vader, I just feel like pointing this out. This is often used to explain why Vader acted so differently in A New Hope. Because the Vader we saw in A New Hope was basically just an enforcer. Just as he was intended to be in the original draft of that script, or of that movie. I guess those both work. So, he didn't really have the intrigue or presence or anything else that makes him Darth freaking Vader, arguably one of the greatest villains of all time, and pretty much often considered the greatest film villain of all time that he has, that is established in Empire in Return, because Anakin was basically completely dormant within Vader. But from this point on, from the moment this movie starts, Anakin is now cognizant, aware, present, whatever you want to call it. And all of that means. So, food for thought there. But getting back to my question, it's another one of those situations I feel a pseudo-Lich King situation. In other words, Anakin, of course, wants to see his son again. Of course he does. Why wouldn't he? Anakin Skywalker was always someone who cared tremendously, and arguably never really learned how to deal with loss. We'll talk about that more later. But, so Anakin would desperately want to see his son, just to see his son, never mind the possibility of being with him, growing with him, learning about him, you know, that kind of a thing. And so he could then twist those thoughts in his own warped perception so that Vader would just as much want to find Luke. Because after all, Luke could be turned to the dark side, couldn't he? And then he could be with his son. And I mention this because, to make this clear, this is not two personalities, okay? This is not a distinct, you know, Kerrigan versus the Queen of Blades situation. This is one person who has different aspects of his own personality conflicting with each other, just like real people do, which is one of the things that makes him a character, not a caricature. So his own desire to see his son is not just that he wants to see his son and be with him, but that he wants to have him at his side. He wants to join with him, to grow with him. He wants to actually, when he offers to rule the galaxy at his side, that offer is genuine. He really wants that future. Him and his son together, moving the galaxy as it should be. And so both aspects of his personality want the same thing for basically completely different reasons. And yet at the same time, it is kind of the same reason when you think about it. Food for thought. Another few things that note, I mentioned earlier, that time has noticeably passed in the movie. Obviously, the actors look a little bit older, but there's a few other little tidbits. Again, visual storytelling. The rebellion is obviously better equipped and better armed and better prepared, better trained in general. They've obviously been doing this for a bit. Han and Luke have obviously developed a tremendously strong camaraderie, and it shows on the screen. Han and Leia have started to grow closer to each other, and I'll talk about that more later. And of course, Vader has gone from being, basically a lapdog to being in command of his entire Star Destroyer squadron. Now, I mentioned that last one kind of as a joke because obviously Vader was always one of the most powerful men in the galaxy. So, yeah. But regardless, the notion that time has passed is clearly there, especially with the reveal of the most beautiful ship in the world, which of course is in his first scene in this movie. But I digress. Let's talk about Han and Leia. Their dancing with each other is marvelous, in my opinion. See, on the one hand, we have... okay, first of all, Harrison Ford has clearly found the perfect niche of playing his character. He is just the right amount of jerk with a heart of gold. Again, the origination of the cliche. He does have both elements to him. In fact, he is, in all intents and purposes, a fully fleshed out character. And you see him react to situations fluidly, dynamically, as a character would. But the way he... well, okay. His natural confidence kind of makes it so that Leia's automatic rejections of him make her more appealing to him. Which is interesting because that is what causes him to continue to pursue her in his own flirtatious, barely not quite serious manner. But in so doing, he continues to be in her presence and interact with her and actually grows to become her friend, which allows real feelings to develop underneath all those layers and all those masks, his facade that Han carries. And it's very on display throughout this movie. By contrast, we have Leia, her experience, her poise, her history, leader of the rebellion, former senator, all this fun stuff, basically leads her to naturally push Han away. And yet, in so doing, she actually cannot help but feel guilty at doing so because she does honestly admire the man. She does actually have a genuine affection for him, regardless of romantic feelings, because she believes he is a truly good person at heart. And let's be honest, he is. And he also looks like Harrison Ford, so that can't hurt. But I digress. I'm just messing. If you feel like seeing the other side of this argument, she looks like Carrie Fisher. But again, that's not the point I'm trying to make. The real point I'm trying to make is that because of her desire to keep him present, because of her admiration of him, because of her affection for him, because of her respect for him, she gains more exposure to him, which allows a friendship to bloom, which allows actual feelings to bloom. And I like the fact that it's apparent, even in this film, that the two of them are not just people who have been flirtatiously or whatever, and don't just fall into a relationship with each other, as so often happens in movies. These are two people who, first of all, do not end up in a relationship by the end of this movie, but second of all, and more importantly, have obviously been dancing around each other emotionally for quite some time, sufficiently such that they have actually grown to the point where they really do have real feelings for each other. And this is really, really fleshed out in the books, but I digress. One other thing I like about Han Solo is everything about him can be summarized by the following exchange. Sir, the temperature's dropping too rapidly. That's right, and my friend's out in it. You'll freeze before you get to the first marker. Well, then I'll see you in hell! The moment I saw that scene for the first time in the theater with my mom, I realized the kind of character Han Solo really was. I shouldn't even say realized. It's more like it was established. It was a good way to start off on a strong foot, and again, really show how this was much more of a character-driven piece. While there is a crisis that is being faced by the characters, at no point, especially on an analysis mode, does that crisis feel like it is the focus. It is all about everyone's interactions with each other. And I'm just focusing on the humans. 3PO's interactions, Chewbacca's interactions, R2-D2's interactions, the way all of these people coordinate with each other, interact with each other, and constantly try to intermingle and mix and care about one another is so much of the focus of the early chunk of this movie, and arguably the entire movie. I also just feel like adding, I like the portrayal of environments so severe that even to such an incredibly advanced society, technologically speaking, as Star Wars has, it's still a hassle, difficulty, and in some cases just basically impossible to adapt to it, Hoth being a good example of that. Another thing that's nice is Han's ingenuity. I've talked about this before. Han is not an idiot. He is actually quite smart. But most of his intelligence is in his cunning, his ingenuity, his improvisation. Which is funny because Harrison Ford is often said to be the same way. His capacity to think on his feet is part of what makes him Han Solo. And his thing with the Tauntaun right at the beginning, obviously people have made jokes about that for forever, you know. I thought they smelled bad on the outside, you know. Everything in this movie has been quoted and made jokes of to nth and back. But looking at it in the original context, it actually makes a lot of sense, especially since he says that to himself, don't forget. But of course he does, because he just did something horrible and he needs to make light of it because he just did something horrible because it's what he had available. Making do with what you have is something Han Solo is very good at. I already talked about the Han and Leia dance. I already talked about the most beautiful ship I've ever seen. Some people may not realize this, but Admiral Ozzel was always doomed. He was actually set up to fall here, basically, primarily by Mara Jade making a deal with Vader. There's a whole thing about that. I'm not going to bore you with it. But I just mentioned that because it's so obvious in the way that Ozzel is treated in this one. He is treated as if he basically has no authority and no significance in his presentation, because now in the confines of just the movie, we look at that as if he is a weak leader, even though he's an admiral, but whatever. Piet, by contrast, actually does a much more competent job, despite screwing up at least once, arguably twice. But he nevertheless portrays more of a charisma to him than Ozzel ever did. Ozzel always felt a little bit more sniveling. And I'm going to comment on two things about that. The first is the establishment of Darth Vader as a character. The man who just so casually sits there and holds an idle conversation with someone else while murdering someone else without breaking or pausing or showing any sign that he is murdering him, just doing it straight-faced, so to speak, is very Darth Vader, and very much helped establish the character in our minds firmly. You are in command now, Admiral Piet. But the second thing I want to mention is why the extended universe is amazing. See, the Ozzel situation, okay. The reason the extended universe, one of the reasons why the extended universe is amazing, or at least has the potential to be amazing, is because so much of that, you look at the extended universe, it's like, wow, it's amazing how well that fits with the movie. It's almost like they planned it that way. And when in many cases you can say, and I've done this myself, you look at the movies and it's hard to believe they didn't plan for things to unfold the way they do in the extended universe. But they didn't plan that at all. And that's why the extended universe tends to be good, or indeed amazing when it is amazing. Because a lot of the people who work on it used a strong foundation and establishment, which was put forth in the movies, and then built on that in its natural progression. So yeah, it does flow naturally in most cases, and it does make sense in most cases, and it does look like they set it up in advance because that's what they were building off of. They looked at the Ozzel situation and said, yeah, he's kind of a sniveling whiner, isn't it? Why don't we make it so he was a political expedient and we want to get rid of him, and that's why he was the admiral of that ship. Because that fits what we already saw in the movie. You see? And they do that a lot, especially with Empire. See Shadows of the Empire for a very good example of that. One unusual thing about movies, this is true across sci-fi in general, is that oftentimes ships and equipment in general tends to be weaker than it actually should for the sake of dramatic personal. A lot of times writers will basically bend over backwards trying to explain why, for example, the Executor was taken out by an A-Wing. Now, the writers have gone out of the way and explained why that happened, and I could tell you, but I'm not going to. That's going to be in the next video. But the point is, for movie purposes, a lot of times the ships are just kind of, eh. And a good example of this is when the ion cannon managed to disable an imp star for long enough for a few ships to escape. Yeah, right. But another comment about that is relevant is the AT-ATs. The All-Terrain Attack Transports. See, the reason this happens, and I'm going to describe this, is when it comes to a writing perspective, ideally you want the heroes to outthink their enemies. You want the heroes to prove their intellect or cunning or bravery by managing to outsmart the villains in some way or another. And so the most common way to do that when it comes to scale battles, such as the Battle of Hoth or indeed anything else of a similar nature, is to have basically what comes across as a glass jaw scenario. In other words, the enemy is completely indestructible unless we find this one weak point, and then BAM! And then the AT-AT is destroyed by a few shots for some reason, just because they knocked it over. Which doesn't make any sort of logical sense whatsoever, nor does the fact that they can just knock over AT-ATs at will. And that does kind of bother me, admittedly, but it's understandable why they do that from a writing perspective, especially since they usually, if they do it well, emphasize that all that's doing is stemming the tide, not creating a victory. And they do that in the Battle of Hoth. They do manage to destroy several AT-ATs. They do actually manage to get several transports away, and that manages to grant them the incredible success of barely escaping with their lives. And that's why it works in this case, I feel. Even though it is kind of like, huh, every time I look at it, and the, the ship buff in me and the strategy buff in me just goes, whatever, I can still buy it because they don't win. They didn't earn that victory, after all, so they don't get it. Instead, they get a retreat. And then the hyperdrive and the Millennium Falcon doesn't work. So, let's talk about Luke Skywalker. And his... Okay. Luke is interesting because he has a very natural use of the light side. Which is interesting to me because he was raised with the idea light side good, dark side bad. Although... it is worth noting that the dark side basically wasn't really mentioned or indeed explained, nor was the Force for that matter, until this movie. But I digress. But so he naturally uses the light side of the Force basically because the light side of the Force could be best described as naturally working with the flow of fate, the way things should be, rather than trying to enforce the way things you want them to be, right? I mean, there's several other ways to define the light side versus the dark side, and indeed the many permutations of the Force, but in general, the light side tends to go with the flow, whereas the dark side tends to interrupt the flow to make A, B, or C happen. I just mentioned this because early on that kind of fits Luke's personality, but as he grows, as he comes to care, and indeed as the events of these movies happen, it becomes clear that that's not really Luke Skywalker, and it's one of the reasons he starts using the dark side so extensively, and indeed becomes arguably one of the definitive Grey Jedi, in my opinion, of the entire franchise. Because he wants to help, he wants to take care of things, he wants to make things better. But not in a, I will fix the world way, in a, I want to save my friend, I want to help these people, I want to take care of these people kind of a way. And that naturally uses the dark side. And then he willingly allows himself to learn of the dark side and its usage from Palpatine in the Dark Empire series, which I highly recommend. And then basically never stops using the dark side from that point on. Because the dark side is all about imposing your will through emotional strength upon the universe, rather than, enforcing that order amongst the chaos, rather than finding the order amongst chaos, as I mentioned before. And I just mentioned that because it's interesting the way his character develops in the Force throughout this film, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I do like another contrast between Leia and Han that is presented here. We're still at the Battle of Hoth. Leia is very stubborn, and it's... she's very self-sacrificing, but almost too much, to the point where she is willing to lose herself and other key personnel, which is not a tactically sound decision, in order to ensure that other people get away, because that's just her personality. By contrast, Han is much more pragmatic and much more willing to do what is necessary because he is a realist and understands the situation is bad. Don't forget, it's worth noting that he was trying to get her to her transport, not the Falcon. And the only reason that failed was because of that ice cave-in, which blocked the way. Thanks, Empire. Now, I mentioned earlier Vader is fixated on Luke. Vader, Anakin, whatever you want to call him. It's interesting to note that he really does turn all of his resources to him. He burns lives, resources, personnel, all sorts of things throughout the course of this. The way he goes through the asteroid belt probably emphasizes this more than anything else. He is so fixated on getting Skywalker that everything else is basically irrelevant to him. And that is kind of Vader's character in a nutshell. It's numbers on a page to him. He doesn't care. He does have things he cares about. But the things he cares about are worth any amount of what he doesn't care about. Money, people, power. He has bajillions of that. So much that he doesn't even feel like counting it. What he cares about, he is willing to spend as much of it as necessary in order to make it happen. And he spends Star Destroyers to get a ship so that he can torture its occupants just to get the attention of Luke Skywalker. Think about the severity of that, for example. Think about the fixation involved in that. Think about how much that shows, even just in the movie, ignoring the books, ignoring the extended universe. Think about how much that shows Vader cares about getting his hands on Luke Skywalker. Now, tiny couple little notes here really quick. It's mentioned in the extended universe, but I always thought this, even back in the movies, that Yoda basically disrupts Luke's sensors on his descent into Dagobah to encourage him to use the Force to help himself descend, which of course he doesn't, which is why he crashes. His first failure, one of many I might add. But then the other thing I want to mention is, for quite a period of time, Luke Skywalker, that is to say Mark Hamill, was the only person, the only human being on a fairly large set talking with a Muppet. And I gotta give props to Mark Hamill. Lots of props are given to actors in the modern age for acting around people who are wearing gray suits with buttons and lights on them. And they deserve that praise, don't mistake me. But I find it interesting that Mark Hamill was able to put forth such a knockout performance while talking with a puppet with no other human interaction. That being said, I have to give tremendous props to Jim Henson and the company, because, oh my god, Yoda is one of the best puppets I've ever seen. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but it is amazing how well that has aged. Which brings me to my next point. I've often said that CGI should be used in accent of traditional effects, and I want to give you a specific example of this. I guarantee you that 20 years from now, people who have the same aesthetic style as myself, I gotta phrase it that way because this is all about opinion and preference, will look at the Empire Strikes Back Yoda and say that looks better than the Revenge of the Sith Yoda. Now, if you look in the prequels, even between Episode 1 and Episode 3, they clearly improved their CGI, and Yoda specifically does look different throughout that original trilogy, or the prequel trilogy, I should say. But the point I make here is that CGI by default will always age a little bit more poorly because of the fact that special effects technology is advancing so quickly. So even if it looks decent at the time, there's a pretty good chance it will not work after a certain period of time. There are very few exceptions to that. Most of the exceptions have to do with very careful usage of CGI in specific ways that hide the weaker points of that CGI. See Jurassic Park, the original, of course, as an excellent example of a movie that used heavy usage of CGI that worked very well and still looks good to this day. But the point here I'm making here is that one of the advantages of having a physical thing, a puppet, as Yoda was, is it's there. You, the audience, can tell that that's a physical option. It's a distinction in your mind. Don't tell me you can't tell the difference. You can tell that there's something there and that he is actually physically interacting with a physical object, a real object, and that helps flesh it out in your mind without even acknowledging it or needing your mind to comprehend the fact that you're looking at a real thing. It just automatically processes in the back there saying that's a real thing, which helps bring it a little bit closer to believability and otherwise immerse you more in the story. Now obviously this is not always true because there's such a thing as bad puppetry, bad props, etc. But when you have Henson, and the General Henson Company, which does amazing stuff, that stuff tends to age very well because they put so much effort into making it. Honestly, the animation, I shouldn't even say the animation, the way they animated the Yoda puppet is phenomenal. I was blown away rewatching it, how realistic and how amazing of a job they did on that. A couple more tiny little thoughts. There's a scene where Vader is actually seen in his thing without his helmet. You just see the back of his head, and then the helmet lowers, and then he turns to talk to Veers, I believe. I mention this because that scene was specifically included for only one reason, and that was to prove to the audience that Darth Vader was not a droid, which was something that was actually a concern at the time, and indeed one of the more common theories going around amongst the theory crafting community, was that Vader was an extremely advanced droid. I mean, after all, C-3PO and R2-D2 do, for all intents and purposes, appear to be alive, sentient, etc. Why couldn't Vader? So they wanted to show that specifically for that purpose. I'm not going to comment on the Palpatine makeup. I am going to comment on how amazing Palpatine's introduction is in this movie. This is the perfect way to emphasize a character. I've talked about this before. Establish a character and then have that character react in a certain way to another character, and therefore you would help establish this other character as well. Darth Vader, someone who has been established a lot in this movie, someone who is incredibly powerful, someone who is incredibly demanding, very much on top of things, is willing to burn all his resources to make this happen, all this fun stuff. He is told that the Emperor commands him to make contact with him, and instantly, no hesitation, no pause, get us out of the field so we can make a communication immediately. That line, the way it was presented, and the next shot where he kneels on the pad, helped flesh out Emperor Palpatine for the first time. Helped flesh out the Emperor, as we just called him back then, and really helped show what kind of a character he is and indeed would become. And it's one of the reasons why he was so, when we actually saw him in Return, it was so terrifying and so intimidating, especially given things I'll talk about in Return. That wouldn't have had the same impact if they hadn't done that establishment here in Empire. Brilliant work on establishing the Emperor there. Now, here's a question for you. Why? I asked this on my stream. I did not give my answer there specifically to make you watch this video. Why did Yoda agree to train Luke? Now, here's the thing. Luke was basically... would probably be completely refused to be trained under the Jedi. And there's no problem. He would definitely be refused to be trained under the Jedi Order. If they had a process like Tranquility, they probably would have done that to him. You know, he's the wrong age. He has the wrong temperament. He's got family connections that they don't really want to deal with, especially given what happened to his father. And he has already been poked at by the dark side more than once. Luke Skywalker is basically the worst possible candidate for the perspective of a Order Jedi to train. So why does Yoda agree to train him? There's a lot of different reasons that can be given for this. I'm, of course, going to give my theory, as I often do, and I, as always, encourage you guys to share your theories with me. My theory is that Yoda agrees to train him specifically because it is something that the Order would not do. Think about that. Remember that the big lesson he learned in Revenge was adaptability. The one thing that he tried to do, that his master tried to do, that the Order had tried to do for centuries, was to maintain the status quo and to never be prepared for what would come next, only to be prepared for what has already happened. And so in accepting Luke as his Padawan, basically, he was literally acting out that new philosophy, arguably for the first time, willing to go ahead and try this new method and see if he can actually do something with him. Now, I don't think he did that lightly. As Yoda points out, he had been watching Skywalker for some time and obviously saw the potential in him, which brings me to the big difference between Skywalker and Anakin. Between Luke and Anakin. Anakin was taken away from his home as a child, a medium-aged child, but still a child. He was never allowed to grow up. He was never allowed to learn, adapt, understand loss, or consequence, or the ability to cope. Luke has had all of that. Luke already had his childhood behind him by the time the Force ever entered his life. Luke already had a fairly rough and harsh life out on Tatooine for many, many years, and was willing to accept and understand the concept of loss, including the loss of his adopted parents, at the time he thought of as his real parents, long before he ever became a Jedi. And I feel like that difference in loss is one of the key crucial elements that divides Anakin versus Luke, and I think Yoda knew that. Yoda knew that Anakin's greatest flaw, the thing that did indeed turn Anakin to the dark side, was his inability to let go. To such a severe, almost delirious extent, really. Remember in that book I just mentioned, with regards to the Tarkin incident, he sees a vision that actually is Padme's spirit. And when she goes away, he becomes deranged with rage, willing to kill and destroy everything and everyone in his path, because all he wants is her back, because he lacks the ability to adapt to that kind of loss, to cope with it. He never grew that. He never grew that capacity. Luke already did. And so Yoda sees that in Luke, sees that this is someone who might be able to, while he cares, while he does have emotional attachments, use those to the betterment rather than to his own selfish aggrandizement, like Anakin did. But I have no doubt Yoda knew the risks going into that. But to make this clear, one thing I looked up, I even looked this up on the stream, a little over 50 seconds passes between Yoda saying, nope, not going to train you, and him agreeing to train him. And I mention that specifically because that is very significant. Yes, you could argue that Obi-Wan changes his mind, but I don't think that's true, personally. With that quick of a turnover in his mentality, with that quick of a thoughts, Yoda had already made up his mind before Luke ever showed up. Why else would he test him like that? There's no need to test someone like that if you're just trying to do some kind of natural training thing. That's not Yoda's style. You test him because you want to see if they're going to live up to what you want them to, or if they're going to fail you like you're afraid they might. Interesting concept here. One of the lines Yoda says several things. He talks about the difference between the light and the dark Jedi, or the Force, excuse me. And it's our first real examination of the two. And basically serves as the building block for what all of the extended universe has done for the Force, and is the second, debatably the third, but most people consider this the second version of the Force. The Force, for those of you who don't know, has gone through about 7 iterations across the extended continuity and into the movies and looping back into the prequels. But one of the things he mentions, he has this beautiful speech, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. I actually quoted it word for word on the stream. It's a great speech, and it really helped emphasize what the Force was. In that speech, we understood the Force. No need for midichlorians or anything. We understood what the Force was in that moment. It was actually fairly well established mystical element of basically life energy, and that worked. But I mention this because one of the things he says specifically is light side is used for knowledge and defense, never for attack. Now, a lot of people have pointed out the literal usages of that, and instances in which Jedi have been, supposed light Jedi have used the light side for attack, for offensive purposes, and indeed Skywalker himself does that in this movie, and it's often considered one of the first mistakes he makes, not counting the mistake to go to Cloud City to begin with, but you know what I mean, so the second mistake he makes. But I've always felt that was less literal the way Yoda says it. It's just indicative of the way the light side in general works. And again, forgive me for re-quoting myself for like the 5th time now, but light side is about finding order that actually exists in chaos, and therefore is used for knowledge and defense, passive, reactive kind of a thing, as opposed to the dark side, which is about forcing order amongst chaos, therefore being used to attack, offensive, more non-reactive. I can't think what it's called. More not motivated. Shoot, I can't think of it. Whatever, self-motivated, I guess. Now, let's talk about the cave. The interesting thing about the cave for me, there were a lot of, to this day, there's a lot of theory crafting that I've heard about the cave on Dagobah. Now, the obvious thing is that's where one of the great Dark Jedi Masters was destroyed, and there was this horrible, horrible battle between him and Yoda. Yoda ended up being victorious, and his severe usage of the dark side warped and twisted that tree in that cave so much that it was very strong in the dark side even years and years later. But I mention this because the obvious symbolism there is that Luke has the potential to go on a dark path, right? And that if he is not careful, he will do the exact same thing his father did, that Anakin did. That's the obvious thing. The more subtle thing I've always found is I've always felt that that cave is more reactive than anything else. Luke went in there, and what was on Luke's mind? Darth Vader. And so Luke fights Darth Vader. And then he panics. And that's when he kills. You watch the scene. It's in slow-mo, so you really get a good shot of it. Luke actually panics and therefore goes from I'm going to fight Darth Vader to the next logical step, which is I'm going to kill Darth Vader, which may not have entered his mind initially, and succeeds at doing so, which is what then shows his own face. It is his own fear that created that potential scenario because, in my opinion, the cave itself and the dark side vision he was seeing was adaptive to how he was feeling and what he was thinking about at the time. Just my take on it. Let's talk about Boba Fett. Boba Fett is pretty awesome. Most people agree that they should have kept the original voice actor. I am also in that list. But the main reason why is the original voice actor had a surprising charisma to him, despite the fact that he had, I think, a grand total of 5 lines amongst 2 movies. But the way he presented his lines were very brusque, very to the point, and like I said, there was just a natural charisma to him, which is one of the things that gave him that fan power that made him a lasting character and such an important element of the extended universe. Another thing that's worth noting is, well, two more things I should say that are worth noting about Boba Fett. Number one, he holds himself with a certain poise. He definitely commands presence wherever he is, and it's not just the fact that you can't see his face, although that is a huge component of that, but also the way, literally the way he stands, the way he reacts to things. His movement very economical, very precise. He looks like a professional in the way he acts, and it's very well done. But also the fact that Vader at all points basically treats him as if he is an equal. I mention that because he's kind of the only person Vader treats as an equal, with the sole exception of Luke, and even that he doesn't do at first. Luke has to earn that respect. But he has a certain amount of respect for Boba Fett. And it shows, even in the movies, it shows that that Vader did have that respect of Boba. And I think that's another reason why he had such lasting power there. So let's talk about why the ship couldn't go to light speed. One of the reasons. I'll talk about the other reason later. And that reason is, as a writer, you have to create a situation in which your heroes can't just snap their fingers and get out of a situation. And honestly, Lightspeed kind of is that when you think about it. Oh no, we're being chased by an entire fleet of Imperial ships. It's okay, we went to Lightspeed, and therefore the entire problem went away. Making the hyperdrive not work on the Falcon was a brilliant move in its own right because it ensured that the Falcon would constantly have to deal with Vader harrying them. And it is a little cliched, I'm not going to lie about it, but I think it was presented well enough that it never bothered me, especially given its thematic significance in a bit, which I'll talk about pretty much towards the end. Now, there's another reason for that age requirement for the Jedi, just to diverge for a moment. There's this brilliant, brilliant scene where Luke tries and fails to raise the X-Wing. You know the scene. You know the scene. Don't lie to me. But I'm going to talk about the age requirement first. It's actually mentioned in The Matrix, too. The idea is actually very natural because this is true in real life as well. A younger mind is less established and therefore can be more adaptive to things that older people would consider impossible. So theoretically, if the Force or magic or the Matrix or whatever was real in real life, a kid would have a much easier time mentally coping with that than an adult would, because an adult has had 30, 40, 50, whatever years of dealing with mundane, normal, everyday life that is concretely programmed into their brain, and they would have to spend all that time unlearning that, just like Luke does here, just like Neo did back in the Matrix, etc., etc. By contrast, a child could just look at that and much more quickly and easily understand, oh, okay, this is different, I get it, you know, and therefore be more capable of doing so. It is also worth noting, to be a little more sinister about this, that a child's mind is a little bit more programmable because of that same reason, which would be another good reason why the Order, not the Light Jedi, but the Order of Jedi, would be so inclined to get people who are more susceptible to their particular, if you'll forgive me for the quote, narrow dogmatic view. So I mentioned the Yoda scene that I was just talking about. Two wonderful moments about this. First of all, try not. The whole quote is, try not. Do or do not. There is no try. People have tried to dice apart this phrase over the years as meaningless drivel. I disagree. Because the entire point of the phrase is not the literal meaning, but rather the intent behind it. In other words, if you go into a situation saying, I am going to try, you are mentally convincing yourself before you have even tried it, haha, of the fact that it is possible to fail. You, in other words, to put it bluntly, lack confidence. Real life this is especially true in real life, but this is just as true in fiction. When you go into a situation with confidence, you have a much higher success rate. Because you go into it with confidence. You don't go into it with knowledge and understanding. You don't panic. You don't freak out. You don't have hesitation. You know, there doesn't even need to be a mystical or mythical or otherwise non-literal element to this. The brain functions differently when you are confident because it'll work. You don't question if it will work. You don't act differently because you know it will work. By contrast, when you don't know it will work, when you're hesitant, when you're not sure, you'll act differently. You'll function differently. So, yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. But I love his line because that has always resonated with me in real life throughout my life, is the idea that, you know, don't go into a situation saying, I will try. do or do not. You know, walk into it knowing that you have the confidence to do this, or knowing that you lack it. And that distinction will help, in my opinion. But I digress. Watch Yoda's face. This, in my opinion, really speaks volumes of Yoda as a character. Watch his face. Brilliant puppet work. Brilliant puppet work. When Luke starts to lift his X-Wing out of the swamp, and he gets excited, overjoyed even. Do you know how hard it is to lift something like an X-Wing? I know he says size doesn't matter, but it is established within the canon that the larger the object, the more difficult it is to move. You have to literally call more of the Force to move more mass. It's pretty linear, right? So the fact that Luke was succeeding at all, Yoda's ecstatic. He's overjoyed. Oh my god, Luke's actually going to do it. This is wonderful. I'm not going to fail this time. Do you think Yoda is unaware of his failures? Back with the old order, most of whom are dead? Back with Anakin, who is the reason so many of them are dead? He is well aware of his failure. I imagine that joy on his face as he realizes his training has been successful. He has helped someone to grow and learn in the Force, to accomplish something so amazing, which makes it even more crushing when Luke fails. Watch his face again as he crumbles. Yoda just looks down, discouraged, disappointed in himself, at his own foolishness. You can see, it's just a puppet, but you can see emotions play across his face as you see him, you know, his shame and his guilt and his grief and his understanding that he failed again and that he has not succeeded in this task and that he has not redeemed himself yet of his follies, you know, just, beautiful work there. I also, two more points here really quick. First of all, Boba Fett. The thing I love about Boba Fett is all they show is a scene of him being in the trash with the rest of the trash and therefore following the Falcon. That's a great scene because it emphasizes Boba Fett's character in one beautiful shot. It shows that he is sufficiently well aware of the little tricks, of the underside, of the illegal side of the galaxy, to know how to use them and exploit them to his own purposes. And he just guessed, that that's exactly what the Falcon did. And he was right, and that guess paid off, which also emphasizes Boba Fett's character in a nutshell, his instincts, his willingness to go out on a hunch and accomplish whatever. It's one of the reasons Fett is often credited as being the best bounty hunter in the history of the franchise, and that's some impressive company, by the way, if you're not aware. There's been a lot of bounty hunters, and a lot of them have been good, but most people agree Fett was the best, and that's pretty much the reason why, in a nutshell there. The other thing I want to comment on in this scene is 3PO. I mentioned this back in, I believe, Phantom Menace, actually. 3PO is very much the everyman. This is shown a little bit in New Hope, but this really starts to flesh itself out here in Empire. He is someone who is surrounded by extraordinary events and extraordinary people, and he's just an ordinary guy, basically, when it comes to his personality. Yes, I know he's a droid, but he is just an ordinary person who doesn't know how to really cope with or deal with these things. The mere fact that 3PO thinks that surrender to the Empire is an option, in the ignorance of such a thing, and the willful ignorance, the self-delusion of thinking that that will work out well, is what I mean but when I say the everyman. He is what most ordinary people would actually react like in such a horrifying circumstance. Another interesting thought here. The light side tends to work best in the absence of emotions, right? The funny thing is, we know this from the extended works, but even here in Empire, this is shown because Luke sees a vision of his friends hurting and dying, and therefore he feels strong emotions, which breaks his control, which then breaks his capacity to use the light side of the Force. Again, this is another example of the extended universe building upon the strong foundation we already had in the movies. And I found that to be a nice little touch there. So then we have Billy D. Williams. We're at Cloud City now. We're getting to the finale here. I probably haven't been talking for too long. For those of you who don't know, Billy D. Williams, who plays Lando Calrissian, was also going to be playing Han Solo. He was one of the people who signed up for that back in A New Hope. It's rather natural that he was brought back here, especially since they weren't 100% sure when they started the initial work on Empire that Ford would actually be coming back for return. By the time they were actually filming, Ford had decided he was going to go and stay on for Return. But there was a safe move to kind of replace him with a similar type character in Londo. It's one of the reasons why Londo is, in many ways, a scoundrel, a smuggler, to use the archetype, in the similar way that Han is. But that being said, I do not want to discredit Billy D. Williams' performance, because he is amazing. He does a great job of Londo. He is very charismatic, he's a very good person, and he is, ironically, an idealistic person. I've always felt that Londo is what Han would have been if Han had become more of a businessman than a scoundrel. Han has seen the underbelly of the galaxy. It's one of the reasons why he's so cynical and pragmatic. By contrast, Londo is someone who has become very successful, and not just here. And it's shown, it's emphasized, or I should say, it's inferred in the movie, but it's shown in the extended universe. Londo is someone who has great business acumen and knows how to make something work for him, and has been pretty successful even prior to Cloud City. So this is someone who, whilst having the same general character traits at Han, took a different path in life, thus helping to distinguish him even here, back when he was made as something of a surrogate. Also, watch Londo's face during several of his scenes. He's got the same facade, mask thing that Han does, but watch his face as several things happen, most notably when he is, I've made a deal that will keep the Empire out of here forever. Look at the way he's expressing himself. It's clear he is steeling himself for this. He does not want to do this. He hates the idea of doing this. And when they confront him about it, he says with almost tight-lippedness, "I'm sorry. They got arrived here just before you did." And you can see in his face, he feels horrible about it. He feels incredibly guilty about it, and he knows it's wrong, and he is trying to justify it to himself, because after all, he's responsible now. He's responsible for many more people than just his old friends of Chewie and Han, and even Leia for that matter, but mostly Chewie and Han. He's trying to justify it to himself. It's not until the deal gets worse and worse and worse, to get to the point where Chewie's life and Leia's are directly threatened, that he finally is like, okay, this isn't working. I am not going to stand by this, which is one of the reasons I've always loved Londo as a character. He's probably one of my favorite extended universe characters, right up there with Mithra Naruto and Gilead Palayan, is because he is a truly good person at heart. He is the kind of person who will go through hell and back, pick himself up, and keep right on going. And he will at no point in time hesitate to do the right thing, because it's the right thing to do. And I like that about Londo, and it's shown even here in this movie. I had a note here that I mentioned on the stream. Luke is definitely a light Jedi, at least at first. I've often argued that he is pretty much the Grey Jedi, but he is without question not an Order Jedi. And the reason why is an Order Jedi would never let things, would always let things be. They would try to be passive, or try to postulate neutrality, or try to just let fate work itself out, and things will just function the way they should. Even here in this movie, even when Luke is pretty much firmly using just the light side, at least until the duel, he wants to change things. He wants to help. He can't just let things be. He has to get out there and help his friends. He has to get out there and save them. And it's funny because he keeps making this comment to Yoda, "I'm going to come back, I'm going to come back." And Yoda just keeps kind of sighing, because Luke doesn't get that simply by leaving he is failing his training, like basically irrevocably. And yet whether that's a good thing or not is debatable, because again, this is Yoda, obviously a great person, but someone who kind of has failed at training more than once in the past because of his adherence to doctrine. And so, just a little bit of a food for thought there. I also have a note here. I'm just going to go and share it. It's interesting that the training happens over the course of a fairly short period of time in the universe. And so Luke didn't have too much time to have his head filled with nonsense. Again, I quote Palpatine, the narrow, dogmatic view of the Jedi. Moving along. It's also interesting to see Yoda gambling. I mentioned this way back in Revenge of the Sith, too. The idea that Yoda is basically gambling with Luke and with Leia, and that if Luke ends up failing in this task to restore some semblance of peace or order to the galaxy, that at least they have that backup plan. I mentioned this, though, Because keep in mind, Yoda had more than enough power to restrain Luke. If Yoda genuinely felt that Luke leaving would be the end of everything, there's a pretty good chance that Yoda would have restrained him. Literally, used the Force. I mean, it's freaking Yoda. He could do that. But he doesn't. Instead, he basically assists him in leaving. All he does is try to convince him not to. Why? That one made me think for quite a while, and my end-up result is what I already said. Yoda is gambling. He's doing the same thing I mentioned when he agreed to train someone who is basically the worst possible candidate for training. He's trying something new. We'll see how it works. It is worth noting that Luke Skywalker did fail at Cloud City, but I'll talk about that more later. Let's talk about a little bit of film photography here. We're basically building to the climax here. In modern cinematography and editing, most especially, filmmakers tend to emphasize blues and oranges. The reason why is basically laziness. To put it simply, the human skin tone is closest to orange, and if you want to contrast that, you just have there be blue, and so therefore everything is blue and orange. And trust me, look into movies. It's very common, especially in the last decade or so. And it is basically done, I shouldn't say laziness, that is being too facetious. It's too disheartening. It is worth noting that a lot of the people who work on editing have very, very tight deadlines and very, very small budgets in order to make something. So yeah, most of the time I don't actually feel bad because that editing team has to get this out now, and therefore they go with what is easiest and therefore quickest to do, which is blue and orange. But I mentioned this because back in the day, the line of thought was usually go with colors that complement each other rather than contrast each other, unless you're doing a black and white type of thing. So lots of greens with browns and lots of yellows with greens, and that kind of thing. Autumnal colors or summer colors or winter colors. That kind of a palette. A deliberate choice was made to make the carbonite chamber orange and blue. Lots of stark orange and lots of blue to contrast it, because they wanted it to be very dark. They wanted it to be very cold. They wanted to have that very, not cold, they wanted it to have that stark contrast that actually gets across in your perception of it, that it feels both hot and cold, literally, at the same time. And they wanted something so that when the actors were there, they could still be viewed, because they tried a few other things and it was literally too dark to see the actors. But still really helped emphasize that feeling. See, here's the thing, and I talked about this with Baronessa briefly on the stream. Empire is a dark film. When I first saw this as a kid, I remember being genuinely freaked out by this film. When I first saw it in the theater, I was like, oh my god. Because Empire starts kind of dark, and it never stops descending. It just keeps getting darker and darker and darker as things just getting more and more desperate and more despairing and more horrible. In a beautiful, wonderful way, but I can only appreciate that with the advent of age and perspective and experience. As a kid, I was just looking at it like, oh my god. And that all really starts to come to a head in that carbonite chamber. The moment we first see that, it is officially everything is wrong, everything is bad, and it's not going to get better. And we know that. And that's one of the reasons they did that style, deliberately, to get across that feeling. This is bad now. And it's not getting better. Han's face. No, I'm skipping a step. Han's transference of the life debt to Leia. For those of you who don't know, when Han told Chewie to take care of Leia, he was literally transferring his life debt to Leia. Now, life debts are a big deal amongst the Wookiees, and Chewbacca especially took that very seriously. And I have no doubt that Han knew the full significance of what he was asking. That Han, as of that moment, was, again, no masks, no veils, no facade. What mattered to him was the woman he cared about. Take care of the princess. He knew that he was probably about to die or worse, and was resigned to that fate, and he wanted to ensure in the way that he knew best would happen. The only power he had left to him, in other words, was to transfer that life debt to Leia to ensure that Chewbacca would take care of her, because he trusted Chewbacca that much that he knew Chewbacca would rather die than let something bad happen to her. And it really, that one scene really, really screams of the significance of the connections between these characters that we've seen grown throughout this film and that have grown off camera. Again, brilliant character stuff. And then we go to the brilliant, brilliant scene itself. For those of you who don't know, which is approximately 0 of you, the original lines were Leia says, you know, I love you, and Han says, I love you too. Now, this was actually true even up to the point where they were filming. Harrison Ford said the lines, and everyone involved said, that doesn't work. Ford said it didn't work, the director said it didn't work, Lucas said it didn't work, and everyone was like, okay. And they tried a couple of other things, tried a few different ways of saying it. Nothing was working. So then finally Irvin, the awesome director I mentioned earlier, turned to Ford, who was well known for his ability to improv even by this point, and said, go with it. Whatever comes to the tip of your mind, just say it. And then he says, he comes up with the, I know. And they liked it so much that they then reshot the scene to actually show the final take we see, which is when he really says it with wonderful emphasis. I know. And the way he says it is brilliant. I couldn't possibly emulate. Everything else on my notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I have 7 more notes here, and all of them have to do with the finale, the climax of Empire Strikes Back. I'm just going to put my notes away. I don't need them at this point, to be a little bit blunt. This entire movie has been about Vader and Luke. It has been about Luke Skywalker, a man of destiny and greatness and influence, tremendously strong in the Force, and all of the people who have been involved around him and his life and are affected by it, and Darth Vader, a tremendously powerful, tremendously influential individual with great power in the Force and all the lives affected by his life. And the whole movie, thematically and literally, has been about all of those lives being hit in the middle of this conflict between Luke and Vader. The whole movie, the one plot, I mentioned the plot way back. The reason the plot, despite being so threadbare, works is because that plot comes back so brilliantly here. It builds up and builds up and builds up until everything pays off in this final sequence of scenes. The carbonite chamber, brilliant. The fact that the characters are so in stark, dark contrast, brilliant. The lighting of the lightsaber, Luke does his first, then Vader, slowly, brilliant. No music. No music. I don't think I ever even noticed this before. Not without analysis mode turned to crank. But think about it. Up until a certain point, it's Luke and Vader, and it's silent. No music. And then it cuts to everyone else trying to escape. And then there's music again. But then it cuts straight back to Luke and Vader. Music immediately cuts out. Just like that. The silence speaks volumes. I mentioned back in Revenge of the Sith, and I've mentioned many times before that this is my favorite lightsaber duel ever. But when I was in Revenge of the Sith and I saw the great one between Obi-Wan and Anakin and how amazingly presented it was, I was torn as to whether or not that lightsaber duel actually trumped this one. Having now rewatched this one does trump that one. This is still an amazing, incredible lightsaber duel, and the reason why is because the duel itself is another aspect of their characters' interaction. It is the literal physical payoff of the entire film. The entire movie has been about Luke and Vader, and this is finally the two of them coming to a head. It has all been about this duel. In the entire movie, we knew what was going to happen. The entire movie, we knew it was building to this. Ever since we saw that title crawl go across the screen, and we knew it was going to culminate in this, and everything about it screams of the significance of it. Luke is nervous, anxious, trying to master his fear, trying to remember his training, trying to use the dark side. His movements are edgy, careful, but cautious and quick. Vader's are slow, confident, in control, very economical in his movement. Vader stays on the defensive, testing him, toying with him. Vader doesn't take him seriously at all until he gets out of the carbonite chamber. And that's the first time he starts to try. And you can see it. And then the next time they fight, Vader comes at him again. A little bit stronger, a little bit rougher. Starts to use the Force on him. This is one of the only moments we have music. as he uses the Force, and a wonderful rendition of the Imperial March starts playing, which is basically Vader's theme. As he hits Luke, who is desperately trying to deal with this onslaught of the Force, basically, until finally they're flung off, and Luke flings himself down, and then the next time they fight, now Vader's actually trying. Now Vader is actually basically trying to kill Luke. Not because he wants to kill him, but because Luke has earned his respect enough that now Vader is willing to put forth effort into it. And then Luke hurts Vader. Luke actually injures Darth Vader. There's a brilliant scene in Shadows of the Empire that's done from Vader's perspective, where he's dueling a droid, which is unbeatable, unstoppable, trained with masters of the sword arts, and incredibly quick, lightning-fast reflexes. I believe the exact quote is, okay, I don't know the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, against any other opponent, it would be deadly and unbeatable. Vader crushes it like a bug. And the whole time he's fighting it, there's this one thought that keeps going through the back of Vader's mind. His shoulder was definitely feeling better. The one mark Luke managed to make on him. Do you know how long it's been since Darth Vader has been hurt? And the funny thing is, it speaks volumes to his character that he is so enthralled by that. He is happy, overjoyed. His son is everything he wanted, and more. He is so exuberant. Imagine the disappointment if his son had not been strong in the Force, if his son had not been capable of dealing with him, of withstanding him. But he was. His son held his ground against the great Darth Vader, slayer of dozens of Jedi. How happy Vader must have been. Two things happen in short succession after that. Vader chops off his arm, very quickly actually, chops off his hand actually, basically in retaliation. Most people think, and I agree, that Vader was actually so shocked that Luke actually hurt him, that Vader just basically went all out. For just a little bit, Vader stopped, he was going at like 70% up to this point. He wasn't holding back, but he wasn't going full tilt. Then Luke hurt him, and then he went full tilt and took off his hand and ended the fight. Bam. Because he's Darth Vader. And then he makes the offer, because now he knows, you are my son. I am your father. And he says it with such pride. Sometimes I wonder what would happen to Anakin if he had the same lessons Luke did. Let me explain. Luke lets go. Lets himself fall. And, well, okay, let's actually rewind. Let's actually rewind real quick. It has been often said that it is difficult to pull off something that is basically written as Narm and make it sound dramatic. And it's true, because it is very hard to pull that off, speaking as a voice actor and an actor as well. It is difficult to pull off what is effectively a no without it sounding like no, because that just sounds stupid. Mark Hamill is a brilliantly talented voice actor. And in my opinion, Mark Hamill is probably the definitive no across fiction, movies I should say, in general. The way he says it, he throws himself into it. You can see on Hamill's face, you can see on Luke Skywalker's face what that means. To know that his father is alive, and the immediate realization of how horrible it is that the most dangerously evil, psychotically screwed up, horrible person that he has been fighting his whole life, that he has hated ever since he learned of his existence, is in fact his father. The emotional weight of that destroying Luke. And then he lets go. Was it because he accepted the Force? That something might save him? Given the way he acts later, I don't think so. I think Luke, destroyed as he was, mentally and emotionally, saw Vader and knew Vader's offer was real. And in that moment, the only thing he could think of was ending it. He got lucky. Literally got lucky. That brings me to my final point. This movie has been all about Luke and Vader, and everyone who has been caught in their wake. But right at the end, who is it that decides the fate of the galaxy? Who is it that determines what the path is and the fate is of Luke Skywalker, and by extension, the entire galaxy? It is not Luke and it is not Vader. It is not these grand, tall, powerful figures that stand astride a galaxy that determine its fate. It is literally the little people. Leia, 3PO, Chewbacca, Lando, and R2-D2. These people determine the fate of the galaxy. These people struggle to escape under their own power, barely manage it, pull together, survive, get out, rescue Luke. Granted, Luke had a bit of a hand in that because he called the Leia. And then there's this wonderful thing. I told you I'd mention the hyperdrive again. The hyperdrive working here is a get-out-of-jail-free card, just like it would have been earlier, but it's used here because of its thematic significance, not just because it's the end of the movie. Because for the first time, it is not the big movers and pushers that are changing history. It is not the fact that I'm going to go out and do my own thing that is going to change history. For the first time in the entire movie, the whole gang, minus Han, is actually united. The people are actually working together, and that's when the hyperdrive works. Now, obviously that doesn't work literally, but thematically, the significance of the fact that that cooperation of the little people is when things worked out is hard to miss. And I love that. I absolutely love that. Which brings me to that point I mentioned earlier. What would Anakin have been like if he had had this lesson? If he had had this dose of humility that Luke just got delivered to him? Full frontal, in the face, smacked across the skull with it. Lost a few teeth in the process. What would Anakin have turned out like if he had learned this lesson that Luke just learned? Final note, and then I'm done. I mentioned earlier that this is the greatest fight scene, like, ever in lightsaber history, including in the extended universe. I think the biggest reason I can explain why is what I've come to refer to as the Mass Effect 2 effect. The scope of the threat in Empire is so much smaller than in A New Hope, but the entire movie has been every step of the way showing us the down-to-earth personal interactions of people. It has been showing us the lives that are affected by this relatively smaller plot. So that by the time we get to the movie's end, by the time we're an hour and a half into this, and we are officially emotionally invested in these lives, in these characters, we know that it's not just Luke versus Vader by that point. We know that this is going to determine so much more than that. We know that this is going to affect so much more than just their two lives, and therefore we are invested in it. And that's why the fight is literally the climax of the film, and the payoff of all of that character establishment and all of that character development throughout the entire movie. That's why that fight is so significant, because it is literally right there in our face, and we care about what happens at the end of it. Forgive me for gushing. I love this movie. I suppose the only thing to do now is to talk about Return of the Jedi. I am actually quite curious how that will turn out. I suppose we'll find out then.